So much of what we have witnessed and are continuing to see happening across our nation on all sides has been and is being driven by fear. As all too often happens when we're afraid, if we don't want to run and hide, we tend to respond in the opposite way with anger or seeking to take control of things ourselves. Over the past 2 weeks, we've not only heard angry words, we've seen fear of losing lead to violence on one side, and we've seen fear of being overcome lead to retaliation on the other. People on the left and on the right, including many of us who profess to follow Jesus Christ, have become so fixated on position, on privilege, and on power that we've become willing to say or do almost anything in order to overcome those we see as threatening our hopes or standing in the way of our desires. We might dress it up with words and justifications, but our focus has been on people, on political parties, and on earthly means of procuring or preserving power. Things that I believe grieve the heart of God. So, where should our focus be? I believe God's Word offers us a helpful answer in the life of Joseph, the son of Jacob, found in Genesis chapter 37 to 50. Joseph enjoyed several different positions of privilege and power throughout his life, only to have all but one of them ultimately stripped away from him. And it's in the way that he responded to these positions as well as to the loss of them that I believe can help us and inspire us, instruct us in these challenging times that we're currently facing. You see, more than anything, his constant focus on God and his promises enabled Joseph to persevere and ultimately prevail. And that's something that I believe can help us as well, regardless of what comes our way in the year ahead. Joseph was raised up 4 times to positions of privilege and power. One of them he did not earn, while the others, most people would say, he did earn. Now, I say the first one he did not earn because Genesis chapter 37, verses 2 and 3, shows us that he was born into it. Listen to verse 3. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he'd been born to him in his old age. And he made him an ornate robe. Joseph was born into privilege. Now, perhaps understandably, his brother's response to all of this was not positive. We read in verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him, that's Joseph, more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Unfortunately, Joseph did not help matters himself because of the way that he used his privileged position. The first thing that we read about Joseph is found in verse 2 when it says, Now Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Joseph had his father's love, and he had his father's ear, and he used it against his brothers. His second position of privilege and power was in Potiphar's house. Potiphar was the captain of the guard who had bought Joseph as his servant. Listen to chapter 39 of Genesis, verses 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites. Those are the people that Joseph's brothers had sold him to. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. And from the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had, both in his house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. The third position of privilege and power was not as great as the second, but within the context that he was in, it was privileged nonetheless. I'm speaking about the position within prison in which he had been placed. Listen to Genesis 39, verses 20 to 23. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did, again in a privileged position. And then Joseph's fourth and final position of privilege and power was in Pharaoh's kingdom. In response to Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, along with the plan that Joseph suggested to Pharaoh, we read in Genesis chapter 39, verses 39 to 44. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all of this known to you," that's all of his dream, "there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. It is noteworthy that 3 of these positions were taken away from Joseph by the unrighteous actions of others. First of all, his brothers took away his privileged position with his father, planning to kill him, but deciding instead to sell him into slavery. When he came to check on them in the fields, they stripped him of his special coat and they dumped him into a dry cistern to die. But then they changed their minds when they saw a caravan of traders passing by, headed to Egypt. Listen to Genesis 37, verse 26 to 28. Now Judah said to his brothers, "What will it gain us if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us instead sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." Sounded pretty good. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 silver shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Then we're told his brothers took his special coat, ripped it, and put blood on it, and took it back to their father, leading their father to believe, and they never corrected him, that Joseph was dead. In Potiphar's house, Joseph was thrown into prison after Potiphar's wife unsuccessfully tried to seduce him and then falsely accused him of attempted rape. Listen to Genesis 39, verses 7 through 15 and 19 and 20. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in my care, entrusted to my care. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. So she caught him by the cloak and said to him, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew," she was giving a racial slur, "this Hebrew who has been brought to us has come to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed, and when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of his house." She held onto that cloak and told the same story to his master, her husband. And we're told in verse 19, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger, and Joseph's master took him and put him in prison. Now, though God blessed him in prison, Joseph had to stay in prison 2 extra years because a person that he helped forgot to tell Pharaoh about it. In all of these things, Joseph does not deny the bad things that had happened to him. After interpreting the dream of the king's cupbearer in prison, Joseph explained his situation to him. Listen to Genesis chapter 40, verses 14 and 15. He says to the cupbearer after he's interpreted his dream, "But when all goes well with you, please remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." And even after he was raised up by Pharaoh, he did not forget what had happened to him. We see this in the names that he gave his 2 sons. In Genesis 41, verses 51 and 52, we read that Joseph named his firstborn son Manasseh, which means forget, and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all of my father's household, from which I have been ripped." The second son he named Ephraim, which means twice fruitful, and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Now he's saying that as second in command to Pharaoh, in the land of my suffering. But because Joseph looked beyond these positions and privileges that had been taken away from him, and instead focused on God and his promises, that kept him serving God in each situation he found himself in. It kept him serving God as a slave. As we've seen in Genesis 39, Joseph worked diligently and with tremendous integrity in Potiphar's house. And God blessed Potiphar because of Joseph. It also kept him serving God as a prisoner. Again, seen in Genesis chapter 39, verses 20 to 23 and verse 40, Joseph worked diligently in the prison, blessing not only the prison warden, but also his fellow prisoners. It also kept him serving God when he was forgotten. For 2 years, he continued to faithfully care for his fellow prisoners after his interpretation of the cupbearer's dream had come true, because the cupbearer had forgotten him. And then it kept him serving God once he was in power. All that he did, we're told, blessed Pharaoh and the Egyptians as well as his own people. But focusing on God and his promises did more than just keep him serving God in each situation. It actually preserved Joseph in each situation. It preserved him from giving in to self-pity or a victim mentality. And it actually helped him to see God's hand even in the bad things that happened to him, that his brothers did to him, or that others did to him. Later in the as second in command only behind Pharaoh, Joseph would tell his brothers in Genesis chapter 45, from verse 4 through verse 8, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you once sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me here ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me father to Pharaoh, lord of the entire household and ruler of all Egypt." It also, his focus on God and his promises, preserved him from giving in to the temptations often connected with privilege. When Potiphar's wife tried unsuccessfully to seduce him, he said this in chapter 39, verse 9, "No one in this house is greater than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a thing and sin against God?" He could have said, "Well, I deserve even his wife because I'm taking care of everything." But his focus on God kept him from giving in to that temptation. Thirdly, it preserved him from giving in to bitterness toward his brothers, toward Potiphar's wife, and even toward the cupbearer. There is not one note of bitterness in Joseph about what has been wrongfully taken from him in this entire account. Fourthly, it preserved him from pride. On 2 occasions, Joseph could have given credit to himself, but instead pointed to God as the only one who could interpret dreams. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 8, the king's cupbearer and the baker were troubled by a dream they had in prison, and he asked them, "What's wrong?" And they said this, "We both had dreams, but there is no one in here to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And then he interpreted them. Later in Genesis chapter 41, verses 15 to 16, when the cupbearer belatedly remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh how Joseph had accurately interpreted both his and the chief baker's dreams, Pharaoh sent for Joseph. We're told this, "Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream, and no one could interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.' 'I cannot do it,' Joseph replied to Pharaoh. 'But God can and will give Pharaoh the answers he desires.' And then he gave him the interpretation." Finally, his focus on God and his promises preserved Joseph from seeking revenge. You see, when we're fixated on people, on positions, and on power, when we get in power, we want ours back. After 13 years of trials, we're told he spent 13 years either in Potiphar's house, in prison, being forgotten in prison, before Pharaoh made him second in all the land. After 13 years of those trials, before that happened, Joseph had reason to want revenge, and he actually had the power to exact it as second in the land. But as we've already seen from Joseph's response to his brothers, because he recognized that God's purposes were being brought about even in the bad things that had happened to him, the bad things others had done to him, he had no need for revenge on his brothers or on any others. In fact, it grieved him that they would even fear that from him. We're told he wept about it. When Joseph was a youth, God had given him dreams and promises. But instead of focusing on the people or positions that could have made his dreams come true, Joseph focused on God, the giver of those dreams and promises, relying on him to bring them about at the right time and in the right way. Because he did so, because he did not crave position, privilege, or power, because he instead looked beyond them to God and his promises, Joseph did not have to be afraid of what others might do against him or how they might try to hurt him. And at the same time, that enabled God to be free to raise him up and entrust him with the second most powerful position of authority in the most powerful nation of his time. None of us knows for sure what the next days, weeks, or month will hold in store. But if we, like Joseph, will focus on and put our trust in God rather than on persons or party or earthly power, we will not need to fear any of them. And God will then also be free to move in us and to use us in any way that he wants. That is very good news.